a case study of the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant in the heart of the Hachiman and Luiseño nations. You're listening to American Indian Airwaves County Radio.
You can hear when the moon shines bright, the lone pu'el in the black of the night. You can hear the whisper in the valley. And you know when Kamakani blows to the Pahu drum, it's the warriors who are marching down the mountain, because history ain't no mystery to me.
With 61 operating nuclear power plants with an average age of 35 to 40 years of operations, the question becomes, where do we store the high-grade nuclear waste that's produced from nuclear power plants? As part of our ongoing series on preventing the nuclearization of Mother Earth, we go to the traditional territories of the Hachiman or Juaneño and Luiseño nations located in Orange County in Southern California. There, the San Onofre nuclear power plant was decommissioned in 2013, and its principal owner, Edison International, and its subsidiary, the Southern California Edison Corporation, were planning to store 1,600 tons or 3,600,000 pounds of high-grade nuclear waste just a few miles from the San Onofre nuclear power plant off the Southern California coastlines. For the hour, I speak with Adelia Sandoval of the Hachiman Nation, along with Charles Langley, Nina Babiars, and Robert Pope from Public Watchdogs of Orange County, a nuclear industry monitoring watchdog organization, on how Southern California Edison had planned to bury the 1,600 tons of high-grade nuclear waste off the Southern California coastlines. Presently, Southern California Edison, as of last week, entered into closed-door or secret negotiations with the state of California on where to store the nuclear waste. This is preventing the nuclearization of Mother Earth, the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant, and where to store the high-grade nuclear waste.
Ever since the generator was established in our homeland, it was always a big concern for us because we knew that eventually it was going to have to be dealt with, given whatever was going to happen, because we knew that there was going to be some, just by its very nature, there was going to be difficulties, there was going to be problems. And we didn't know how we were going to intervene in that process because we didn't have the wherewithal at that time to manage that. So the people that work, that do the ceremonial leaders, the people that do the spiritual work, began to work in a way that we dealt with it behind the scenes, so to speak. So that is what I was trained to do, and that's what I continue to do to this day, is I work from that angle.
Adelia, give our listeners a sense of the indigenous nations impacted from the construction of the nuclear power plant and the indigenous nations that could be or will be impacted from the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant and the possibility of storing the high-grade nuclear waste within the area.
Well, our tribal homeland essentially includes San Onofre area, but also the La Jolla people down south. It will affect everybody. I mean, the whole Southern California region and beyond, actually. So we're all impacted. I mean, all the tribes inland, all the even north of us. I mean, it's endless, actually, and all the people that live in this area as well. I mean, everybody. So it's a tremendous impact. It's frightening how it can spread.
Well, talk about the high-grade nuclear waste. And as part of the decommissioning project, the intent, as I understand it, is to store this high-grade nuclear waste within the region, within a few miles of San Onofre. And I was wondering if you or maybe Robert, Charles, or Nina can speak to what this actually means in terms of the decommissioning project within the context of storing high-grade nuclear waste.
So this is Charles Langley. The waste is being stored 36 yards from the water in steel cans that are only guaranteed to last 25 years. And the waste itself is deadly to human life for at least 250,000 years. So as public advocates, we see this as a clear and present danger to the life and health and well-being of everyone in Southern California.
Charles, talk a little bit more about the process for storing this high-grade nuclear waste, how dangerous it is, and what the potential implications are for humans and all life forms.
Where the waste is now, there are the very long fuel rods. They're about 18 feet long and perhaps a foot wide, and they're stored in a spent fuel pool. And it's deadly. The water there is deadly. If you were to fall into the pool, it's very deep. But if you were to fall in and splash around, it'd be like getting a few hundred X-rays. But if you were to swim way, way down into the pool and get anywhere near those spent fuel rods, your life expectancy would be just a couple of hours. So what they're doing is they're going to haul the rods very carefully out of the pool, and they're going to put them in these giant steel cans. The steel cans are as thick as the diameter of a dime, actually a little bit thinner, about 5/8 of an inch. And they'll hoist them into these cans, and they'll put as many as 37 in a can in an aluminum basket that holds them. Then they fill it with helium and seal it up. Then they move it to the beach. And one of the big fears of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is something called a cask drop, because plutonium is 6 times denser than gold. So each of these casks can weigh as much as 500,000 pounds. They're about 5 feet across, 20 feet high, and they weigh 500,000 pounds. So if you were to scale that down to the size of, say, a beer can, it might be a 50-pound beer can. And even a drop of just a couple of inches could crack the cask. If the cask is cracked, the helium leaks out, air leaks in, there'll be hydrogen off-gassing, and there's a potential for a hydrogen explosion inside one of these 75 canisters. And our concern is that could create a really devastating event, because the plutonium inside these casks is equivalent on average to 9.3 nuclear warheads.
Robert, you're a hydrologist for Public Watchdogs of Orange County, and we were just listening to Charles talk about the steel canisters and the potential danger of storing this high-grade nuclear waste in these steel canisters. And so my question for you is, have we seen any compounded and adverse environmental effects or impacts from the operations of the San Onofre nuclear power plant since 1968 when the first unit went online, and then 1983 and 84 when units 2 and 3 went online?
The compounding effects, what's the environmental issues that are present from those past operations include subsurface contamination that Edison actually hasn't made public yet. There is a lot of subsurface contamination with different operating units of the facilities, past facilities like Unit 1 and the present Units 2 and 3. And there's been environmental impacts in the past. The kelp forest kill offshore, that 2 miles of kelp forest was killed by releases, controlled releases supposedly, that Edison was actually allowed to perform into the ocean environment. And they only reported those on an annual basis, and I'd be real curious to learn about individual incidents of how much and what was released into the ocean environment in the past. But as far as all those are concerned with the storage of this waste, I think that they're unrelated, and that those past releases and the past contamination that's present out there really doesn't have an impact on the storage of this waste. But certainly if we did have a worst-case scenario of an explosion related to the storage of this waste, it could expose other wastes that are presently buried.
Robert, are there seismic issues?
I mean, there's seismic risk that's unrelated to what's been released in the past, but we've got a lot of geologic hazards that threaten to cause harm to the facilities that they're building to store this high-level nuclear waste. And there's a number of them. There's the seismic risk, there's tsunami risk, there's rising sea level risk, and then there's non-geologic risks like terrorism. And we've got erosion risks also related to sediments being the bedrock that underlies the area where they're interring these wastes has the ability to be washed out over time as well.
And so what would that mean in terms of the storage facility in these canisters? If there was soil erosion, if there was ocean sea levels rising and an increase in the salinity of those ocean waters, what could be the implications if we see that, because these are conditions that people are projecting to occur based on the way we're heading in terms of the effects of global warming?
I'd like to address that, if I may, Larry. This is Nina Babiars. You know, the permit to bury this waste was granted under special conditions by the California Coastal Commission, and one of those special conditions is that Edison was to have developed and be able to deliver an aging management system or a monitoring system. And so you were asking about the implications. So, for example, if you're talking about corrosion of those casts simply because of the sea environment, it's only the bottom of those casts sit 3 feet above the water table. And so if you don't have a means of an aging management or a monitoring system to monitor if that corrosion or if there's seepage or a leak of those materials into the water table, you've got a real issue there. If you have a seismic situation that threatens the structural integrity of any of those casts because of an earthquake, and you've got a crack, as Charles was describing earlier, again, you have a significant situation of this leaking into the water table with no way of monitoring or then knowing that we have a leak.
Nina, who's responsible then for the monitoring and the maintenance and the emergency response for this storage facility?
Well, Edison is responsible, and as well as the California Coastal Commission, because the California Coastal Commission granted Edison the permit only under the condition, a requirement that they have an aging management system, a monitoring system for those underground storage tanks once they're in the ground. So you actually have the agency that gave them the permit that has defined the requirement that Edison cannot meet. And so it's the responsibility of that California Coastal Commission to revoke that permit if the requirement by Edison cannot be met.
Nina, what are the qualifiers then for that permit?
Well, I'll quote their own words, because in the application that they made for that permit, they indicated that they not only did not have the technology, nor did they know how to acquire the technology required in order to develop those systems. And so, they're asking really for that requirement not to be enforced, and that's, of course, an unacceptable situation.
Well, how are they temporarily storing the nuclear waste then, and then how do they monitor that?
Well, that's a good question. Right now they have some of the previous waste from Unit 1 in a vertical storage, but this storage that we're talking about is going to be going straight into the ground, to be buried into the ground. It's a different type of storage.
You're listening to an exclusive interview with Adelia Sandoval of the Hachiman Nation and Charles Langley, Nina Babiarts, and Robert Pope of Public Watchdogs of Orange County on preventing the nuclearization of Mother Earth, the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant within the traditional territories of the Hachiman and Lizeño nations. And now back to the interview. So where do we go from now then? Because the way I understand it, we're talking about if there is any kind of radioactive plume, that there's about 8.5 million people that live within a 50-mile plume zone. We're talking about along the coastline there, that's a major trafficking corridor in terms of our highway system, but also our rail system.
Well, that's how I got involved, because I work in transportation. I got involved because we've got the second busiest rail corridor in the United States that goes right through San Onofre and an interstate highway. And the reason I got involved is exactly what you're talking about. In 2012, we had a radiation leak, and there were people exposed to radiation unbeknownst to them. If that were to occur with the goods, that the commerce that's being moved on that rail line or being moved by truck to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach and for distribution across the country, how do you get that genie back in the bottle? You may have exposure to people, companies, other rail lines, et cetera, unbeknownst. And all the more reason we absolutely have to have a monitoring system. So we need to get those 8.5 million people, and probably twice that may ultimately be impacted, to just stand up and speak out on this issue, become aware, become informed, and to demand that requirement for the monitoring be enforced.
I talked to Ian Zambarte. He's a Western Shoshone community member and longtime activist, and he's been on the front lines of the Yucca Mountain Storage Repository since 1986. And when I was talking to him a few weeks ago, he was talking about how there's 61 commercially operating nuclear power plants with 99 nuclear reactors in 30 states throughout the United States, and that the U.S. government's plans are to store most of this high-grade nuclear waste at Yucca Mountain. Now, the problem is the U.S. government can't prove ownership of Yucca Mountain, but what he was saying is that essentially that at all of these nuclear power plants, they are de facto high-grade nuclear waste storage facilities. Would you agree with that?
Well, they could become that, because we have provided the Department of Energy $40.2 billion in 40 years, and they have not done their job to find a national repository for this waste. And so I'd like to point out, Larry, that if Edison gets away with burying 3.6 million pounds in one of the most pristine beaches in the world in the middle of 8.5 million people, beside the second busiest rail corridor, an interstate highway, an earthquake zone, et cetera, then it's going to set a precedent. And what we're talking about is of national consequence, because we have 104 of these nuclear plants that are no longer competitive. All you got to do is pick up the front page of the business section, Westinghouse gone belly up, et cetera. And so they're not going to be able to remain competitive. And as a result, as they shut down, if we set this precedent here at San Onofre, then it will enable and it will set a precedent for that to be buried on site across the country on the top of water tables, just like this is, and that, again, is unacceptable. It is of national consequence, and people really need to wake up, force the Department of Energy to do their job. They've had 40 years and $40.2 billion, and they've not done their job.
Hi, Adelia. What I was saying is that indigenous peoples are always on the front line when it comes to the non-renewable resource extractive industry. So when it comes to the uranium and the nuclear power industry, indigenous nations are on the front lines in terms of the mining. And that's clearly evident if we look at the Dene or Navajo Nation or some of the Great Plains nations that have had experienced a long history of uranium mining companies operating within their traditional homelands. Then you have indigenous nations being impacted from the construction of these nuclear power plants. And now you have indigenous nations being impacted from the potential, from the storage, right, of this high-grade nuclear waste. And so my question was going to be, what do we do with the high-grade nuclear waste that we have? Has anybody seen viable solutions on what to do with it? Because you have the average nuclear power plant is about 40 to 50 years old. And so we will experience the accumulation of even more high-grade nuclear waste within the immediate future.
It's tragic. Every angle you look at it, there is no happy ending in a lot of ways because of there is no solution because no one thought it out. That's typical of human beings, is that they begin to do something and they don't look at the end result. The housing industry has just put houses all over places, not paying attention to the pathways that the animals travel, and so they wonder why the mountain lion comes into their backyard. But it's because their backyard is in the pathway of where they've been walking for centuries, and so it's the same in this situation. No one thought it all the way to the very end. They just started pulling this out of our Mother Earth, pulling it out, without any forethought on what was going to be done. And this yellow powder is so powerful. I mean, it's probably one of the strongest things that our Mother Earth has within her belly. And people started pulling it out, thinking, oh, yes, and making money. Millions of dollars they've made money on pulling this powder out, not realizing that it eventually may be our very, very demise. It has definitely impacted the indigenous people from the beginning. They were the ones that mined, didn't know what they were doing, and tribes were just devastated by it.
Larry, as a geologist, I'd like to contribute something as well. I did some work with the Utah chapter of the Navajo Nation where much of this uranium was mined from. And at the time, we understood what kind of health concerns were there, and we understood what kind of personal protective gear would be necessary to protect the miners, yet we didn't give the miners that protection they needed. And the native population that was recruited for the mining activity suffered. And then the rock flour that was a product of the mining activity that was present in unlined tailings piles by the hundreds all around the Navajo Nation wasn't managed the way we already knew it needed to be managed. And this stuff would become airborne, or it would be found and used for like adding fine material to gardens that were becoming more and more gravelly, or be used as mortar for people's homes, and they were being exposed to the radiation. And what we've done is it's like we've unleashed a wild dog, and the only way we can manage this is to reduce the waste so that it's separate from itself so we can't have a criticality event, and to return it from where it came. And I would hate to burden nations again, but to me, I see one possible solution would be returning it to the mines that it came from, but in a way that honors the safety and the security of the people and pays them appropriately for that service. So that would be a breakthrough because that's not what's happened historically. But that would be one way. I know the French, they take their nuclear waste and manufacture a glass out of it. And in that glass form, they're able to inter it in deep storage in the earth without having the fear of a criticality event.
Well, I guess my response to that is that, or why should indigenous nations who have already experienced, to put it politely, the colonial burden, the extraction of uranium, the displacement, the removal off their traditional homelands for access to that uranium, the impact indigenous nations have sustained from the construction of these nuclear power plants, why should indigenous peoples bear any additional burden for the gross negligence and the implications of the nuclear power industry that Americans have benefited from?
Yeah, they absolutely shouldn't, in my opinion. It would only be if it could somehow occur as a win for them, that as an opportunity. But it's certainly they don't deserve to have any additional burden than that they've already been given through the decades and centuries of what's been going on here.
So you mentioned the French in terms of how they deal with their nuclear waste, and I was curious, do you, Robert, or does anyone else, are they familiar with a practical solution or alternative solution in dealing with this nuclear waste? Because as I mentioned earlier, most nuclear power plants on average are 40 to 50 years old, and this issue of what do we do with the nuclear waste that's been produced from the nuclear power plant industry is only going to get worse before it gets better.
I think that leaves us speechless here because it's like we've unleashed a wild dog that won't die for 250,000 years. There's no easy answer to the situation that's been created by the nuclear energy industry.
Well, what about, you said the French were producing a special type of glass as a byproduct of the high-grade nuclear waste, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, and does that have any potential here in the United States?
I think when it comes to who is using nuclear energy most effectively at the least risk to the population, they may be the brightest example. Perhaps there's others out there. I think we can learn from who appears to be doing it better than we are. Certainly, it would be hard to believe that anybody would be doing it worse than we are right now.
Talk about who are some of the additional responsible actors, because we've mentioned the California Coastal Commission. Obviously, the plant and the storage facility falls within the state's jurisdiction, but does it remain within the state's jurisdiction and within the agency's jurisdiction once this becomes a storage facility? And what are some of the roles of some of the other federal and or private agencies with the San Onofre decommission project? And given the Trump administration's budget cuts to, say, the Environmental Protection Agency of 31%, are there any implications as a result of this administration's plans to cut the budget for any of the principal actors involved?
This is Charles Langley, and the Trump administration just budgeted $120 million to study the reopening of Yucca Mountain, which was closed because when they were digging that deep geological depository, they essentially found water and the threat of water, and you just can't have water in nuclear waste. It's a recipe for disaster in the long term. So it was scuttled. There's been talk of reopening that, which I believe is on Shoshone land.
Yes.
One of the crazier things about this is that the Department of Energy is deeply involved in the nuclear waste issue. In fact, 60% of its budget is for nuclear waste. However, Rick Perry, our new head of the Department of Energy, wanted to destroy that entire department and apparently was unaware that its primary responsibility was handling nuclear waste. So we still have an administration that's in a lot of chaos. I'm going to venture a guess that it's pro-nuclear and would like to solve the nuclear waste problem so that we can build more reactors, but I don't really know what's going to happen in terms of that. Regarding regulatory authority, it's a very curious situation because the state of California claims that it's unable to regulate radiation. They're saying that it's only the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that can do that, even to the point where under the California Environmental Quality Act, they claim they're not allowed to do an environmental impact report, which includes radiation. So they are not allowed to evaluate the poisoning effects of radiation on any potential development under their interpretation of the law, which we think is ridiculous.
Charles, just for clarification, they're not able to or they're not legally permitted to conduct those radiation studies?
Yeah, allow me to repeat. For example, the Lands Commission has to issue a similar permit as the Coastal Commission did in order to complete the burial of this nuclear waste. Right. They're claiming that the environmental impact report, which is required under the law, cannot evaluate the effects of radiation on the beach. So what we're going to get out of our State Lands Commission is a report on where the boulders can go and what's going to happen to the beach in the event of excessive erosion and things like that. Where do the roads go? How do they mitigate those impacts? but they're not going to look at the impact of having 75 containers, each one containing this equivalent of what was released at Chernobyl on the beach, and what would happen if one of those containers leaked, exploded, was attacked by terrorists, anything. So that's the absurd reality of our political and regulatory situation here, and this is the absurd reality of San Onofre in general, is that our regulators have failed at every level. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has failed to protect us. The California Public Utilities Commission has failed to protect us, and so have the politicians.
Charles, if California Coastal Commission's claiming they cannot discern the effects of radiation exposure to human beings, then which agencies responsible, and what's their role?
Well, CEQA is a state law, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a federal agency. And they've really acted like emperors or overlords. In fact, when Senator Barbara Boxer wanted to look at critical documents showing malfeasance and potential criminal activity by Southern California Edison in the construction of the nuclear generators that failed, they forbade her from looking at the documents. They said, you can come into our library, into our reading room, and you can look at these documents, but you can't take any with you. Fortunately, somebody leaked a very important document that predicted exactly what happened and what went wrong from the NRC, and we got our hands on it. And we know from looking at those documents that they did not follow their own rules, their own regulations, and that Edison acted with incredible recklessness when it deployed its experimental steam generators at San Onofre.
And you're listening to an interview with Adelia Sandoval from the Hachiman Nation and Charles Langley, Nina Babiarts, and Robert Pope of Public Watchdogs of Orange County on preventing the nuclearization of Mother Earth, the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant, and the quagmire and paradox of storing the high-level nuclear waste, possibly along the Southern California coastal lines within the traditional territories of the Hachiman and Luiseño nations. And that concludes the first segment of our two-part segment on tonight's show. You're listening to American Indian Airwaves County Radio. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. In the final segment of tonight's show, we go back to our two-part segment on our 1-hour special on preventing the nuclearization of Mother Earth and the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant, where Southern California Edison is attempting to store 1,600 tons or 3,600,000 pounds of high-grade nuclear waste within 36 yards of the nuclear power plant. The power plant is located within the traditional territories of the Hachiman and Luiseño nations in Orange County in Southern California. And now back to the interview with Adelia Sandoval from the Hachiman Nation, Charles Langley, Nina Babiarts, and Robert Pope of Public Watchdogs. Nina, what happens next, especially for all humans and all life that lives within the 50-mile radius of the San Onofre nuclear power plant?
In addition to the California Coastal Commission permit granting Edison permission to bury this waste, there's another huge event that needs to be addressed, and that is back on June 4th and 5th of 2015, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission granted Edison's application for all emergency planning and public notification exemptions. And when the NRC granted Edison's application for those exemptions, they then notified FEMA that FEMA was to no longer be responsive in case of a radiological incident at San Onofre. FEMA in D.C. then notified FEMA Region 9, which includes the state of California, of the same, and FEMA Region 9 then notified the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services. So right now, if there were something that would occur, a radiological incident, the only response that the population that we're talking about that would have exposure would be handled by San Diego County and Orange County Emergency Services. And I'd like to point out that, when the NRC gave that direction to FEMA and FEMA Region 9 and the Office of Emergency Services for the California Governor's Office, that the level of funding also went with that direction. And so right now you have what normally was the quarterly testing of the siren that would go off at San Onofre when there was a radiological leak. There was a test of that siren every quarter. That funding for that that siren is no longer going off. The telephone that used to go from San Onofre into the Transportation Management Center, basically a command and control center when we have our fires or when there's a need for evacuation, 2003 and 2007, that phone line is now dead. And so Edison has been granted by the NRC all emergency planning exemptions for everything except the little site of San Onofre that they're responsible for. And I would like to point out that when, we had a radiation leak, it's not like our fires. You can't see this stuff. You can't smell it. There's no other way unless there is a monitoring system. So it's more than just the permit of putting it into the ground. Edison had to go one step further and ask for an exemption of all emergency planning and public notification. So that's also something that needs to be addressed. And none of these answers are easy, but now is the time to be doing the hard work, not later, because later may be too late.
If a government agency is granting an exemptions, what's the trust responsibility of that government agency to citizens then if that's being broken by granting exemptions to a private corporation?
It is upon the responsibility of the public to start holding these agencies and our elected officials. As Charles indicated, this regulatory process has been broken. And everybody is pointing, you've got an agency pointing the finger at the other guy. I mean, to put it in simple terms, everybody is just pointing the finger to the other guy to take care of the responsibility that they're slated for. So these agencies that we're paying good money as taxpayers to be responsible and that we have entrusted, this is a betrayal of the taxpayer, really. And they need to step up and do their job, be responsible for what they promised they would do. And it's up to us as a public to hold them accountable.
Well, and that also begs the question in terms of the people that have benefited from the operation of San Onofre in terms of receiving electricity that's generated by that power plant. But what does that mean for ordinary taxpayers? Have they been paying into a fund that Edison or any other private energy company could utilize for purposes like this for decommissioning, say, a nuclear power plant like the San Onofre decommission project?
Right from the very beginning, before the plant was even built the first time in, 1968, there were trust funds established specifically for exactly what you just said. And that money has been paid in by the ratepayers, and Edison has paid, money into those trust funds. And so, that's another level of scrutiny that should be reviewed and possibly audited. We need to get our heads out of the sand because there's about 3.6 million pounds of radioactive nuclear fuel that's ready to be buried in that sand. So the public, we need to get our heads out of the sand and see just exactly what has been done with these trust funds because, the ratepayers, for the most part, are also the taxpayers. And so now you have legislation that's being proposed that may shift that responsibility to the federal government. Well, that's us. That's the taxpayer. So Edison made bundles of billions of dollars in profits on what we're talking about, and it's their waste. And so I would think that they would be socially responsible to, clean up their own waste.
Nina, who ultimately bears the burden when it comes to this business practice of externalities? And by that I mean companies that adversely cause human or environmental health effects are exonerated from any responsibility, but the public assumes that responsibility of the business's adverse human and health effects because the public consumed the product the company produced for their behalf.
Well, you got to keep in mind, too, that all this time those utilities have really put obstacles up to those consumers about their options of, solar and other alternative means of energy. And so that's a factor that can't be ignored either. They've put up obstacles so that, and that's one of the reasons you're hearing now about community aggregate options that the public wants to explore other options for their energy and cleaner means of getting it. So, that's part of that equation as well.
Well, we've been talking about the San Onofre Decommission Project, its environmental or compounded environmental implications, because there already has been environmental implications in terms of the mining of the uranium to the construction of the power plant and the potential implications it could have on future generations of not only people, but the plants and animals within that region. We've talked about the lack of responsibility and the inability at the local level to provide appropriate emergency response if there was any type of nuclear fallout. And so the question is, where are we now in this process, and what can people do to strengthen and preserve any sense of humanity and life in the context of dealing with this high-grade nuclear waste produced from the operations of the San Onofre power plant since the 1960s?
Well, you've raised some great questions, and everyone listening to a program like this really needs to talk to every single buddy that they know. And people just need to really raise this to a level of awareness that it can no longer be ignored. I mean, for the most part, a lot of the corruption that Charles talked about earlier in the interview and all of what's happened behind closed doors, these secret meetings that have brought us to this point are just no longer acceptable. There are answers. We've got to put our heads together on this, but, pushing it under the rug is not going to get us there. And so one of the things that people can do is support organizations like Public Watchdogs to call their elected officials and tell them that they want answers. They want, San Onofre on the board agenda so that this can be discussed, to show up at public meetings, whether it's the city or the metropolitan planning organizations, the San Diego, the Orange County Board of Supervisors, or the cities, and say, listen, we want you to speak up on our behalf. There needs to be some scrutiny as to what level of campaign contributions have been taken by these elected officials that are making these decisions, and whether or not they're making the decisions on behalf of who's contributing to their campaign or their constituents' personal safety.
And you're listening to an interview with Adelia Sandoval from the Hachiman Nation, Charles Langley, Nina Babiarts, and Robert Pope of Public Watchdogs on preventing the nuclearization of Mother Earth, the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant, and Southern California Edison's attempt to store 1,600 tons of high-grade nuclear waste off the Southern California coastlines. And now back to the interview. Charles, where are we now in this process? And do you have any updates for us?
Larry, this is really exciting because what happened on last Friday, was that we learned that Southern California Edison has agreed to the possibility of negotiating an alternative location to the current nuclear waste dump, which is 36 yards from the beach. So that's the good news. The bad news is they're going into closed-door negotiations with private attorneys to do it. And while we have real faith and trust in these attorneys because they were the ones who brought the issue to the public eye in the first place, it's very troubling because Southern California Edison has been very successful at keeping their alleged record of criminal activity out of the courts and out of the court legal record. And that's very important, and I think it's ultimately what drove them into negotiations. But even more importantly, touching on what Nina said, public awareness is really starting to build up now. And I think they're afraid of that. They are terrified of people actually talking about this.
Charles, that's good news that Southern California Edison is willing to consider relocating, storing those 1,600 tons of high-grade nuclear waste, but that also means in the process of relocating that waste will become someone else's problem. And therefore, whose responsibility does that problem become? And what's the responsibility of the long-term benefactors, residents or ratepayers receiving electricity over the years that was generated from the San Onofre nuclear power plant?
Well, I can't speak for the long-term benefactors other than I am a ratepayer, and I don't feel that we've been blessed by cheap and abundant nuclear energy, because when you look at the true cost, the environmental costs and the actual physical construction costs of these nuclear power plants, it's one of the most costly forms of energy ever. We've also paid since 1968 as ratepayers, as Californians, into a federal fund designed to dispose of this waste, and the federal government has failed us, and nobody wants this stuff. No sane person would want nuclear waste in their backyard, even if it's 2 miles underground.
So if the outcome of these negotiations is the relocation of storing this high-grade nuclear waste, then it seems like the paradox of storing nuclear waste will continue, and it will be someone else's problem.
Well, I think this is the greatest health problem facing humanity now, and it's also a moral hazard problem, because what happens at San Onofre is what will ultimately happen to the 102 remaining nuclear reactors in the United States. And it always seems to happen in California first.
Do we have any indications of the timeline for these negotiations? And if so, what are they?
The original press release from Edison said that they were to be concluded by the end of July, which also troubles us because these are behind closed doors negotiations that are going to go on for several months. And if they fall through, if there's failure, or if there's an undesirable outcome, for example, if they do decide to put it on tribal lands and that tribe isn't consenting to it, we won't know about that until July. In the meantime, the clock is counting down. They're ready to bury this stuff as of January 13th, 2018. So it's a real problem.
So that means, has an environmental impact report already been produced?
There will be no environmental impact report on radiation effects on the people of California from San Onofre, past, present, or future, because the government of California claims that they cannot produce that report without the permission of the federal government, which they will never receive.
Adelia, any thoughts or comments based on what's been said during almost the past hour for this interview?
Okay, I know this has been a very informative call. And the reason why I wanted you to hear what these wonderful people have had to say is because they've just been educating themselves, being informed, and they have tremendous amount of information. And I felt very limited in repeating what I've learned from them, so I'm glad they were able to be here, that you were able to hear what they have to say. You know, sometimes it seems overwhelming, and just as our ancestors used to do when things got overwhelming, they went always to prayer. And I don't want people to think that it's an easy way out, because it's probably the most powerful thing that we can do as people of the land, as people connected to a creator, as people aware of the animals and all the living beings that are here. And there was an elder that he said that sincere prayer is more powerful than an atomic bomb. And I've always remembered that. I heard that when I was young, and I said, you know, prayer is very powerful. That's why we gather and we pray, because this is we know we can do. We can also get informed and educated, and that's why I'm hanging out with these people, finding out what they're up to. There's other things that are happening. There's something coming up on April 13th at San Diego that we can go to and gather in a peaceful manner. There's also something happening in Las Vegas on April 22nd and 23rd, the Native American Forum on Nuclear Issues at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. So there are things, you know, that we can go to or participate in or find out about to educate ourselves. And I think that's probably also prayer, educating ourselves, starting to talk to each other. You know, the tribal nations, we don't talk to each other. You know, we're all busy doing our own things, but I think we need to gather together more, to communicate more, to get in, you know, to relay information to each other. We're doing more of that with the Luiseno people, our neighbors our relatives actually to the east. And so these are essential things that we can do. But ceremony needs to be done. People need to do what they do for healing and for creating a future that we can all live and be alive in and be happy in. And that comes out of prayer and about our ability to imagine the future into existence. So we are amazing people. We have the skills to do these things.
Charles, talk about the two events that are happening there in the San Diego County area.
There's two events. One is we're doing a town hall and public teach-in in Oceanside, and we're going to just go over the criminal activity that occurred at San Onofre, the geological risks, and the threat to public health and safety in terms of emergency response planning. That's something we're doing on the 13th, and Public Watchdogs has been doing this over and over again all across Southern California because we want to raise awareness. The second, probably more important event is that on the 14th, we're going to have a big media gathering and spectacle. The 14th was the day when this event was supposed to go to public hearing, and we were literally going to be able to go into court and hear the plaintiffs, Citizens Oversight, argue against the Coastal Commission permit that allows nuclear waste to be deposited on the beach. Now, that isn't happening now because at the last minute, Southern California Edison decided to go into secret negotiations, and my belief, partly because they want to keep this out of the public eye, and also because they've gotten a lot of media heat recently because people are starting to talk about this.
Charles, one of the things we talk about is this idea of having relationships of reciprocity with whomever's land settlers live upon. And America is a settler country, and people are settlers, is so long as they are not indigenous to the lands that they live upon. And therefore, in terms of your experience with Public Watchdog being traditionally a non-native organization, and given the fact that you live on indigenous people's lands as a settler, what's been your living experience with indigenous peoples and them defining the relationship of reciprocity as a means for healing?
Well, my feeling is that if we're going to see real leadership, it's going to come from the indigenous community and from women, both of whom are groups that are the most affected by this. Women, because they literally have thinner skin and are more vulnerable to radiation. They have children who are more vulnerable to radiation. And indigenous peoples, because they are truly the last remaining stewards of the planet. And I think it's a voice that's been underrepresented and a particularly potent and powerful voice.
Adelia, any final comments as we close the interview?
As you can see how important it's been for us to reach out to the community and to get educated. And we just so happen to find these incredible people who have been willing to stand in the forefront and to really dig behind the scenes, so to speak, to find out what the heck is going on. And I really appreciate them. And they have such tremendous respect for our tribal ways. And so it's been really easy for me to create relationships with these people. So I'm very grateful, of course, that you're here sharing this time with me. And Larry, I really appreciate that you're interested in really bringing this out to the public because, the public needs to know. And we need to let them know what's going on. I mean, to get it out there, people need to start talking about this. We're not talking about it. And once we start talking about it, then things start to take shape and good work can get done. And you also need to know that good work has been going on. It's just not out there where you can read it on the front page of the paper. But these people have been doing really good work, and so we've had meetings. They've been inspiring people. They've gone down to San Diego and done some good work down there. So I think that's what we're just going to continue to do. And I'm going to be, encouraging people to pray because that's what I do as a spiritual person in the tribe. That's what I do, and I will continue to do that. And that's where I do my best work. But I can also inspire the young ones. I can inspire the elders by giving reports on what's been going on. And and this is truly a teaching in every tribe, and that is that what we do today, we do for the generations to come. And that's our call. We are honoring that call.
The moment of silence is over.
And that was Adelia Sandoval from the Hachiman Nation, Charles Langley, Nina Babiarts, and Robert Pope of public watchdogs on preventing the nuclearization of Mother Earth, the decommissioning of the San Onofre nuclear power plant, as its principal owner, Southern California Edison, is attempting to store 1,600 tons or 3,600,000 pounds of high-grade nuclear waste just off the Southern California coastlines within the traditional territories of the Hachiman and Lizeño nations. And that concludes our show for tonight here on American Indian Airwaves County Radio. A special thank you to our guests for the hour, Adelia Sandoval, Charles Langley, Nina Babiarts, and Robert Pope. A special thank you to our musical guests for the hour, Aragon Starr, Koopa Aina, Tracy Lee Nelson, and the band Blackfire. American Indian Airwaves County Radio is mixed and mastered in the studio of Burnt Swamp Studio in Signal Hill, California. For Marcus Lopez, Fabiana Hirsch, I've been your host for the hour, Larry Smith. Until next time.
Hi, I'm Gregorio Luke, and I would like to tell you about a new way of donating to KPFK. It's real easy. You enter the letters KPFK in a text to the number 41444 and add the amount you'd like to give. It's that simple. Keep KPFK fiercely independent. Now, more than ever, truth matters. Free speech matters. So text the letters KPFK to the number 41444. Do it today. Do it now.
Next time on LA Theater Works, the cynical Alceste is too honest when criticizing a colleague's sonnet.
I'll not back down. His verses make me sick.
If only you could be more politic.
Brian Bedford stars in Moliere's classic comedy, The Misanthrope. Next time on LA Theater Works.